This is Chinmay from Radiance Academy and welcome to our YouTube channel Radiance Knowledge Box. Today I will be explaining the topic Reflex Action. Now, what is Reflex Action? Reflex Action is the quick, immediate and automatic response to a stimulus without the involvement of the brain. Now, for example, if you touch any hot object, you immediately remove your finger from it. This is due to the reflex action. Now on the next funda called the reflex arc. Reflex arc is defined as the shortest path of the nerve impulse from a receptor to the effector, which makes a reflex action possible. So due to the reflex arc, the reflex action is possible. Now this reflex arc consists of several steps. Now let us take a glance to those steps. Step number 1. The stimulus is received by the sensory receptor in the finger. Now this thing over here labeled K is the sensory receptor in the finger. Now for example, let's take this pin as a stimulus. When this pin is pricked into the finger, a stimulus is produced which generates an impulse. Now, step number 2, this impulse generated is carried along by the sensory neuron towards the spinal cord. Now, an impulse is generated over here in the finger. This is carried by the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. Now this is the spinal cord. This whole thing over here is the spinal cord. Step 3. The impulse arrives at the nerve ending of the sensory neuron. Now at first the impulse is generated over here, which is transmitted by the sensory neuron, which ultimately reaches this part over here. This is the nerve ending of the sensory neuron. This thing labeled U is the nerve ending of the sensory neuron. Now step 4. The impulse travels across the relay neuron, or in brackets interneuron, present between the sensory and motor neuron, bracket close, to the motor neuron. Now basically the impulse is generated over here in the finger, transmitted by this sensory neuron, which reaches to the nerve ending of the sensory neuron, which is thereby transmitted towards this green thing labeled W. This is called relay neuron or interneuron, or it is also known as association neuron. Now this association neuron acts as a connection point between this sensory neuron and this motor neuron. Thus the association neuron transmits the impulse from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. Now step 5. The impulse travels along the motor neuron away from the spinal cord. Now let's take a glance again. Impulse is generated in the finger, transmitted by the sensory neuron, then reaches the nerve ending of the sensory neuron, transmitted to the association neuron, transmitted by the association neuron to the motor neuron. Now this motor neuron transmits the impulse away from the spinal cord. This part labeled V is the motor neuron. Now in step 6, the nerve ending of the motor neuron connect the effector organ or muscle. Now this thing over here, these are the nerve endings of this motor neuron. This part labeled B are the nerve endings of the motor neuron. They connect to the effector organ or muscle. Thereby, due to the connection of the motor neuron to the effector organ, a response is produced by the effector organ or muscle so as to what to do. Now let's take a summary of the steps involved in the reflex action. So step 1, a stimulus is produced. Due to the stimulus, an impulse is produced over here in this part. This impulse is transmitted by the sensory neuron towards the nerve ending of the sensory neuron. The nerve ending of the sensory neuron transmits the impulse to the association neuron. The association neuron thereby transmits this impulse to the motor neuron. This motor neuron carries the impulse away from the spinal cord. Now the motor neuron has its nerve endings connected to this effector organ. So therefore an impulse is produced. So this whole idea is a reflex action. Thank you everyone. If you all have any doubts, you all can write those doubts in the comment section. Thank you.